Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little. I'm here today with another fun hand for PokerNews.com, and today is a bit of an interesting one because we have a button open limp. This is from a $3,500 buy-in tournament, and I can pretty much say that this is not a good strategy to open limp the button when you're playing more than something like 35 or 40 big blinds deep. Because if you raise and either of the blinds 3-bets, well, you can call with your decent hands, and you can 4-bet with your best hands and some bluffs, and you can fold your absolute garbage, and that's okay. It's hard to screw up when you're in position, and you don't really mind applying aggression because when you limp, that lets both of the blinds limp and see the flop for free. Now, if the opponent did min-raise here and small blind folded or called, I would definitely call the 6-3 of hearts because it's going to flop well enough, and we're getting great pot odds given there's an ante in play. But the opponent definitely should be raising just to extract value and also to steal the equity from the two players in the blinds. Anyway, this time though, button limps, and now small blind gets the limp. Costs $250 to see a flop when the pot's going to be, I don't know, roughly 2,000 or so. So this is a spot where small blind's thrilled, and I'm also thrilled to check the 6-3 of hearts because it flops pretty well, right? I don't need to raise this hand. I want to just check, see a flop, and go from there. And we see a pretty cool / good flop. King 6-3. 2 clubs. When the small blind checks, if this was a single raised pot, meaning if the button raised pre-flop, I would definitely check to the button because the button should be betting this flop very frequently. However, since it's a limped pot, that messes with the ranges a bit because now the player on the button has what's referred to as a condensed range, meaning they probably don't have the best hands. Aces, kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 9s, ace, king, ace, queen. Basically all the big cards and the big pairs are not in the opponent's range because he would have raised them. Of course, some people don't do that, but the vast majority of people raise their best hands. So, knowing that, our opponent should have way fewer good kings in his range, and also way fewer pairs, like pocket 9s that don't mind betting to protect their equity. So, for that reason, we should at least consider betting this hand. You want to ask yourself, are there a lot of bad turn cards for my hand? Well, there aren't really a ton, but clearly, any card could conceivably be bad here because it could give one of our opponents a pair, like say a 2 comes, they could have pocket 2s. If a 2 comes, they could have 5-4. If a 5 comes, they could have 7-4. If a club comes, they could have had the clubs. So there are a lot of bad cards conceivably for us. Also, if the turn is a club, that's going to give our opponents a lot of equity if they do have a random 1 club hand. So I think this is a fine hand to bet for value and protection, and we have no real reason to think that the button is going to bet here. Whereas if it was a pre-flop raised pot, we have a much larger reason to assume they're going to make a somewhat default continuation bet on this big card, little card board, as they often should. So I'm going to lead here. The pot's not displaying right, but it's about 2,000 chips in the pot. I'm going to bet about 1,500 or 1,600 here. And you may think that's a little bit big and may think we're not going to get called very often. But if someone does have a pair, they're probably going to call. And if someone has a draw of any sort, they're going to either call or raise. And if someone has a king, of course, then we're just going to get a lot of money in the pot. It's not uncommon for people on the button to limp with their hands they don't think are quite good enough to raise. And quite often, people raise all of their aces on the button. So they think, aces are good enough to raise, but kings are marginal, so I'm going to limp king 2 offsuit, which is not a good strategy. But that is what people do. So I definitely think button can have a lot of kings, and small blind could have almost any 2 cards here besides the best hands. So we're going to bet. Like I said, I'm probably going to bet about 1,500. I go 1,300 this time, and I think this is probably a tiny bit small, but it's fine. I would also bet in this situation with something like king 9 or better for the same reasons, and I would also bet with some of the draws, like 7-4 and 7-5 offsuit, and probably 5-4 offsuit as well. I could lead some of the flush draws, or could bet some of the flush draws too, but if you start betting all flush draws and all junky gut shots, you're probably going to end up with too many bluffs in your range to where that allows your opponents to easily hero call you. And you don't really want to make it that easy on your opponents to hero call you. That said, most people in tournaments fold too much. So if people are folding too often, your adjustment should be to load up your range with a bunch of draws. Okay, anyway, I bet 1,300, button calls, and small blind folds. Pot's about 4,800. And the turn is a queen. So now, as on the flop, I want to use a somewhat large sizing to essentially polarize my range to draws and nut hands. You may say, well, the opponent could have king, queen, right? So you need to be very careful. But It's pretty unlikely. Like I said, most people raise king, queen preflop. So this queen is very much a complete blank. A lot of people, whenever they initially start working with me, they'll write out a hand history. The flop came king, 6-3, queen. But say the turn was instead like a 7 or a 2. They'd say that the flop came king, 6-3, turn was a blank. Right? Be specific when you are discussing hand histories with people, because there's a very big difference here between a queen and a 2, because the 2 is actually not the blank and the queen is the blank. So it's kind of a cool scenario where usually the big cards are not blanks, but sometimes they are. Anyway, in this spot, I want to be betting with my best made hands and my draws. Like I just said, we have 48 full combinations of draws here. So I want to make sure I'm betting with my good kings. We want to be betting with king, jack if I didn't raise it, but king, jack, king 10, king 9. Probably don't have king, queen. I definitely raise that. Then I want to be betting with king 6 and king 3. And I want to be betting with 6-3 and pocket 6s and pocket 3s. So as you see, that's also a decently strong and large range of effective nut hands. We could be against king 6 or king 3 here. I want to make that clear. But whenever you have a 6 and 3 in your hand and there's a 6 and 3 on the board, it's kind of tough for your opponent to have the king 3, right? So I bet big, and we are now hoping to extract value from kings and also perhaps get called by flush draws. You may say, well, aren't you pricing out the flush draws? And we are. When we bet this big, our opponent cannot profitably call, but they can still call, and if they call, they're making a mistake. You have to understand, whenever you are betting to protect your hand, when your opponents call, you're essentially saying they are calling incorrectly. And that's fine. When your opponents call incorrectly, when they call a giant bet here, they are losing money. And if they fold out a flush draw, that's not the end of the world either. Most people don't fold flush draws, though. One thing you will find in No Limit Hold'em is most people do not fold decent draws often enough. And right here, if our opponent does have something like 9-7 of clubs, it's probably just a fold, as rough as it is, because my betting range here is the draws and nut hands. And my draws, a lot of them are going to continue bluffing on the river, and that's going to make the 9-7 suited not realize its showdown value when I happen to have 5-4 offsuit, right? Because I'm going to bluff with it. So I bet 5,000. Opponent calls. This is great. Opponent either has a king or a draw, most likely. River's a jack of diamonds. Think about this real quick. Is this a good card or a bad card? Well, seems like a pretty good card to me. The only hand this realistically improves, in my mind, is king jack. But remember, our opponent probably isn't limping king jack on the button. So this is also pretty much a blank. And one of the better blanks too, because if there's something like a 9 or an 8 or a 5 or a 4, our opponent will have a lot of hands like king 9 or king 4. Opponent could also have stuff like 6-5 or 6-4 that would have improved on those rivers. So we're probably not against something like jack 6, right? Because that would likely not limp. Most people don't play jack 6 unless it's suited. But even then, people don't play jack 6 too often. So we pretty much have the nuts, in my mind at least. So given we have the nuts, how much should we bet in order to get called by a king? Or maybe a queen that had a flush draw. That's also a hand that could be here. Our opponent could have queen blank of clubs. That's certainly reasonable. I think if we bet something like 15,000 on the river, our opponent's going to start folding some of those hands. If our opponent has king 2, for example, he may find a fold if we bet 15,000. But I think if we go 8,000, as you see here, our opponent will at least consider making the call. A lot of people, when they do limp the kings and they do limp the queens, they're limping to call down when they make anything decent. And in this spot, given a lot of the draws missed, I think we're going to get hero called a decent amount of the time. I maybe could go a little bit bigger, like 10,000, just because, again, all the draws missed. If some of the draws came in, like say the turn was a 4 and the river was a jack, or the turn was a queen and the river was a 4, I should then consider betting smaller, because then some of the draws come in. What it amounts to is when all of the draws come in, for example, your range, in my scenario here, when I bet the flop, bet the turn, bet the river, is going to be the made hands on the flop and a draw, but if all the draws came in, those are all the nuts. So either I have a strong flopped made hand, like 2 pair, or a good king, or I have the nuts that arrived. That's a really strong range, and it's going to be crushing our opponent. So in that scenario, we should usually bet on the small side because our range is all nuts, right? Any amount your opponent calls is just giving you that money. However, whenever the river breaks off, or the turn of the river break off, and we don't make our draw, now my range is busted draws, which our opponent beats with his whole hand range for the most part, and very good hands that my opponent loses to. And in that scenario, you want to bet big because your opponent doesn't know if you're value betting or bluffing, and that's going to result in them hero calling you way, way, way more often. So we bet 8,000. I think I could have gone 10, maybe 11. If our opponent is like a really good player, which he's not because he limped the button, but if our opponent is a good player, we could even bet something like 15,000 in the spot or 25,000. But I think that's going to start scaring off a lot of weak, straightforward players who limp marginal stuff. So I bet 8, and he called. Good. Maybe we get to see his hand, maybe we don't. Looks like we don't this time. And like I said, most likely the opponent had some weak king. That would be my first and only guess. Weak king or a queen that had a flush draw, but who knows what the opponent really had. Maybe he called with ace high because he just doesn't know what he's doing. So that's going to be it for this hand for PokerNews.com. If you enjoy these hand videos I make for Poker News, check out my training site. You can get a completely free trial there at PokerCoaching.com. There we have a lot of interactive quizzes and homework questions. This would actually make a pretty good homework question because we would go to the flop, small blind would check, I would say, what is your strategy with your whole range? And I'm going to ask you, what does your whole range look like? It's not 100% of hands because we would have raised aces, kings, queens, etc. And I would ask, what are you leading with? Like I said, I'm leading my best hands in my draws. Some people may say I'm not leading anything, and we can discuss that. Some people might say I'm leading any pair, which is probably too wide. We can discuss that. Then we would say, how much should you bet on the turn and how much should you bet on the river? And we can use some math and find roughly optimal lines so that when the situation appears in your games, you will find yourself in this situation from time to time. Maybe not this exact situation, but a situation close enough. You'll have a pretty good idea of how to approach it instead of just trying to figure it out on the fly. So anyway, you can get a free trial there at PokerCoaching.com. We have a ton of past homework questions where you can go do the homework and improve your game. So thanks again. Good luck in your games, and I'll talk to you next week.